The Islamic State, judged by any standard definition of what the modern state represents, is both an impossibility and a contradiction in terms. Well, that is the argument of this book that we are starting today: The Impossible State, Islam, Politics, and Modernity's Moral Predicament. While justifying this argument, this book also highlights some of the other stuff, and it is, you can say, a critique of that there can be an modern Islamic nation state, but it also critiques the modern nation state, and that we will see through its chapters. Well, whether you agree with this argument or not, you will get benefit from this book, that's for sure. Well, this book is written by Wael Hallaq, who is a scholar of Islamic studies and professor at Columbia University. Now, this book has 7 chapters. Well, in this video, we'll just talk about the first 2 chapters, premises and the modern state. So, let's start with the first chapter, the premises. This chapter sets the stage for the upcoming arguments, and it tries to steer clear of any of the accusation that can be made against this project. So let's see what this chapter offers. So first of all, this argument that a modern Islamic state is impossible, it raises two questions. First off, how did Muslims in the past govern their great civilizations and empires? And second, what forms of political rule are Muslims adopting today or are likely to adopt in the future? Oh, well, if we think about the second question that we can answer first, well, as our argument is that the modern nation state is impossible, then we obviously are not looking at the present scenario of governing structures, because those are failure. As Halak says, that the post-colonial nationalist elites inherited the structures of power and then pursued the same colonial policies that they had so fiercely fought against. The nation state thus sits uncomfortably in the Muslim world, as evidenced in the form of some modern Islamic states, as it is a failure. So we cannot look at the present day legal and political practices of Muslims as worthy of consideration. So we go back to the first question, that how did Muslim govern their empires in the past? Again, if our argument is that modern nation state is impossible, then any form of state could not have existed before this, means in the past, while Halak says that the modern state is exclusively European in genealogy, and if it is exclusively European, it could not have been Islamic. We sometimes erroneously and anachronistically claim that some past governing structure was a state, but that is not the case, as Halak argues, especially in the second chapter. And from now on, we are going to be calling pre-modern Islamic forms of governance as Islamic governance, so that we can make a distinction between Islamic governance and the modern state, and then we will be able to look at it as distinct paradigms. Now, as Halak argued that the modern state is exclusively European, so we see that Europe and America, so the West, it sits somewhat comfortably in a present which is its own creation, and the rest of the world has followed or has felt the pressure to follow. So there is in effect no other history other than of a Euro-American history, and non-Western societies, especially Africa and Asia, have lost their history and organic ways of living while they are struggling to catch up with this modernity. Modernists often argue that poverty, disease, and famine have been a lot of humanity since time immemorial. But even if we accept this for the sake of argument, then these modernists must face 2 or possibly 3 counterclaims. Number one is that the problems are man-made problems of modernity. In the past, poverty, famine, and disease were mostly caused by nature and were unavoidable. Today, these issues are largely man-made, resulting from capitalism, industrialism, and environmental destruction. And all these are the products of progress. And this doctrine of progress will be critiqued by Halak in the end of this chapter. And then the second is social fragmentation, that modern state capitalism has broken down traditional family and community structures. This collapse has created isolated, disenchanted, and self-centered individuals, as noted by sociologists and philosophers. And third is environmental destruction. Modern project has caused unprecedented harm to the natural world. The environmental destruction is not just a technical issue, but a profound moral failing, and moral accountability is central, and it cannot be ignored, whether judged by Enlightenment ideals or Islamic principles. And Halak says morality is not just treating others as you treat yourself. It's about being unable to commit harmful acts because you cannot face the consequences of your actions. And Halak sees the main cause of the problem, the relegation of moral imperative to the secondary status, and the divorce of morality from science, economics, law, and everything else. So, if everything is detached from morality, and morality is important, this detachment of morality is the main cause of all the problems, then we have to look for the moral resources in other traditions. That is what Halak says, that this looking for moral resources in other traditions is not a new proposal, as it has been the occupation of a number of thinkers like McIntyre, Taylor, and Larmor. While they limited themselves to the so-called European tradition, he says we will focus on Muslim moral resources as Muslims possess their own rich and extensive tradition rooted in their cultural history. These philosophers focused on the tradition which consisted theoretical and philosophical concepts, but Islamic tradition combines philosophical with sociological, anthropological, legal, political, and economic phenomena, etc. Now, to compare Islamic governance and modern state properly, we need to understand paradigms behind them. And the understanding of paradigm behind Islamic governance and modern state will help us see how these two are irreconcilable, or there cannot be anything like the Islamic modern state. And paradigm is like the main thing, or the thing to which everything else is subordinated. And a paradigm helps us see the driving forces inside a system and the ideas or values that quietly shape how everything else works. Well, a starting point towards the definition of paradigm, Halak says, is Carl Schmitt's notion of central domain. Well, the problems in secondary domains are assumed to be solved naturally by solving the problems which are in the central domain. Freedom, progress, rationality, and everything else derives its meaning from the central domain. And if you see what is central domain in modern state and what is the central domain in Islamic governance, we will be able to unpack the argument. That is, we are going to be doing throughout this book. So Allah gives some example of the central domain. For example, the technical progress. Its overpowering effect gave it the status of a quote-unquote religion of technical progress, which promised that all other problems will be solved by technological progress. Whereas in the age of traditional religion, the central domain is moral upbringing, moral education, etc. Here, the central domain was the technical progress and everything else was subordinated to it. And he gives another example of enlightenment paradigm. He says, although Enlightenment thinkers differed greatly from one another, often having opposite or contradictory ideas, yet the Enlightenment can be understood as a single paradigm because its thinkers shared a common underlying project. Despite their differences, figures like Hobbes, Kant, Marx, and Mill all worked within a shared framework and aimed to replace local traditions, religious authority, and inherited moral systems with a universal rational morality, which were grounded in human reason. This morality was presented as a valid for all humanity and was meant to judge and organize all social and political institutions. Now, again, Halak says that the non-central or peripheral domains are not so much of subsidiary as the central domain is shaped by their influence, and the central domain adopts according to the challenges provided by the subsidiary or peripheral or non-central domains. So there is a dialectical relationship between the central domain and the peripheral domains. Dialectical relationship means that one thing affects the other. So Halak's account of paradigm allows for diversity, violations, exceptions, irregularity, abnormality, etc. The central value becomes dominant because a culture chooses to organize its life, institutions, and problem solving around that value. The paradigm can also shift, meaning that a subsidiary domain can become central, which can be seen in the creation of distinction between fact and value, or is and ought distinction. And this is discussed throughout the chapters. Now, as we have understood what is paradigm, or which is a central domain, we can understand the paradigm of Islamic governance and modern state. So as introduction, the paradigm of Islamic governance is Sharia, and Sharia was constituted by moral law, hence its significance for us as a moral resource. In Sharia, law was a tool that was subordinated to the moral system and not the other way around. There was no distinction between legal and the moral. And Halak says, obviously it was not an ideal society. It had its share of problems, but the paradigmatic efficacy of the moral disposition cannot be questioned. And the entirety of the system rested on the concept of jihad, which is striving towards the accomplishment of this moral end. Allah says that this project of ours might be charged with the sin of nostalgia. But to unpack this, he says that it rests on two misconceptions. This project is not the attempt to roll back the modern project, but it actually attempts to capitalize on the moral resources of Sharia. Halak says that Sharia is institutionally dead, but much that is psychologically and spiritually latent has survived. And second thing is that this charge of nostalgia is intrinsically baseless because it assumes the doctrine of progress, which itself cannot withstand scrutiny. Halak says that the claim that we cannot learn from other traditions is either a sign of narrow-mindedness or arrogance, based on the belief that we are incapable of learning from others, or that modern progress has made us morally superior to the past. And that is what is the doctrine of progress. And he critiques this doctrine of progress. He says that this doctrine claims we are always progressing, we are always getting better, or we always know better, even we know better than a moment before. So the engagement in the discourse of progress is actually an ideological position, and this doctrine fixes the rules of discourse in its own favor. Therefore, it does not entertain any view as any of that would be considered nostalgic, backward, stuck in the past. Now, this does not mean that this doctrine excludes history, but it actually uses history at every turn to justify itself. And this idea of progress rests on the technical science, whose ultimate reference to truth is itself. And it says that we always know better because science has laid the foundation of truth and dictated its rules. And this doctrine of progress never asks profound questions, existential and moral questions, as it cannot handle those, and as it has relegated the moral domain to the subsidiary and unimportant domain. So the problems related to morality are supposed to be solved only if the problems of the central domain are solved. And that central domain is never moral, whatever else it may be. So the doctrine of progress has reference only to itself and nothing else. Now, this doctrine of progress stands on the modern conception of history, where time is seen as having a homogeneous teleological structure in which we are always improving and we always know better. Whereas in many other cultures, history is structured eschatologically, where history is used for moral instruction. But the modern concept sees the history or the earlier phases of history as immature and not able to teach us anything. Now, this doctrine denies history whenever history is used to critique or contravene this doctrine. It is thought that modernity can take care of itself on its own terms, and it is in no need of an old sage to instruct it. Now, no single idea has been more important in Western civilization than this one. So, with all this, we now proceed under the assumption that it is legitimate to invoke any central domain of the moral from past to present that may provide us with a moral resource. And so we start our chapter 2, the modern state. Now he starts the chapter with different perspectives about the state. He says that Hegel attributes the state organic ethical impulse, Marx sees it economic domination, Kelsen sees it as a legal order, Schmidt the political, Foucault cultural discipline and power, and Weber the bureaucratic machine. Now Halak says that all of these are just the different perspectives and not the disagreement. So instead of choosing only one view, Halak suggests that we combine these perspectives to get a fuller picture of what the modern state really is, without accepting the limit each thinker sets. Halak says that to know what the modern state is, we have to understand its form properties. And form is different from the content, and form consists of its fundamental and necessary structures like bureaucracy, and content it can change like economic system. While governments may be liberal, socialist, communist or capitalist, these differences affect only the content, not the basic form or structure of the state. And he says that we are going to discuss the state as it exists and not in abstract or universal terms as it is most often portrayed. So he mentions 5 form properties of the state without which we cannot call the modern state a modern state. And he also says that there is again a dialectical relationship between all of these form properties, and these are not like separated from one another. These form properties are that the state is a historical product, specific historical product. It has the sovereignty and its own metaphysics. State has legislation, law and violence, and there is the bureaucratic machine, bureaucracy. There is a concept of cultural hegemony or the politicization of culture. And let's start with the first, the state as a specific historical product. Halak argues that the modern state is not a timeless or universal institution, but a specific historical product that developed in Europe, and it emerged through unique European changes in economy, technology, society, knowledge, etc., especially during Enlightenment. Although colonial experiences influenced it slightly, but Europe was itself the main laboratory for the modern state. Over time, political theory treated the state as neutral or universal thing, hiding its cultural and historical roots. Halak says that the history of the state is inseparable from state itself, and the history of state is the state itself. And second, Halak argues that sovereignty is the core metaphysical feature of modern state. The state is not natural, but a constructed entity, and sovereignty, which is an abstract and impersonal concept, is what gives it legitimacy. Unlike pre-modern rule, which relied on personal authority or religious order, this sovereignty is constructed around the abstract idea or fictitious idea of will to representation. Now, this will to representation does not have to be real, as it is only imagined. Sovereignty operates both internationally and domestically, means that no authority is higher than the state law. And violence is the way to gain that sovereignty. Violence is not accidental but essential to to sovereignty, both in founding this sovereignty and then maintaining that state. Halak also says that this sovereignty mirrors religious concepts. It is omnipotent, omnipresent, known only through its effects, and it shapes the identity of citizens. So modern sovereignty replaces the divine authority with a secular god, which is the state itself. So the state exists for its own preservation, and citizens may be legitimately sacrificed for it. So there is nothing higher than the state itself, and everything else can be sacrificed for it. And the citizen is the archetype and fullest manifestation of sacrifice, because there is nothing more precious than life except the nation state. And as this makes clear that this concept of sovereignty is fundamentally incompatible with Islamic governance, where sovereignty belongs to God alone. And the third point is legislation, law, and violence. Halak argues that the law is the most direct expression of sovereign will, and therefore it is an essential feature of the modern state. A state cannot exist without the power to make law, because law is how sovereignty is manifested and how sovereignty actually becomes real in everyday governance. A state cannot be a state without the law. And even if the laws are borrowed from other countries, they become the state's law only because state chose them to. And Halak says that state and its legal order and law are not separate things. State is law and state is its legal order. And sovereign will without enforcement through law is meaningless. So violence becomes indispensable. It is the tool that turns law into reality. The state alone decides the limits and forms of legitimate violence, both internally and externally. Even if the law is taken from religion, it is valid only because state chooses that law to become valid. And this is another point for the support of the argument of this book. Fourth is the rational bureaucratic machine. Halak says that the state works mainly through bureaucracy, and this is one of its most defining features. Well, bureaucracy means rule by offices, procedures, laws, regulations, and not by tradition or religion. And Halak says that the central features of this are the principles of voluntarism and systematization. Voluntarism means that bureaucracy is deliberately created by human reason, and it can always be changed, reformed, or even removed by political will. Nothing in it is sacred or permanent. Bureaucracy is highly organized and standardized, meaning everyone is treated equally and according to the same formal rules. But this does not mean that there is equality. In practice, bureaucratic systems are linked with dominant elites. That is why Marx believed that bureaucracy should disappear from the future communist world, since it subjugates one class by another. Even revolutions do not eliminate bureaucracy. It always survives and keeps expanding. Over time, it becomes a centralized, hierarchical, and deeply involved with everyday life, from education, health, work, travel, everything. And the fifth form property is cultural hegemony, which is the state's ability to penetrate into the culture, to justify itself. And mentioning Kelsen and Foucault, he says that society and culture are not separate from the state. Like laws, education, language, institution, everyday norms slowly train people to think and feel like they are the subjects of the state. The state spreads its values so deeply that people begin to accept its authority willingly, not just out of fear. They even agree to sacrifice their own lives for the state, for the nation. And any state which is not able to penetrate culturally is either not a state or it's a weak one. So the culture does not stand above the state, as that will undermine its sovereignty and authority. So these are the five essential form properties without which there is no modern state. From the next chapter, we will start looking at how Islamic governance is completely different thing from modern state and even better.